good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where you are in the world. It's great that we have so many people online. I'm very excited actually to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Fearon. She's an epidemiologist at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And those of you who are familiar with her work may know that she works on HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa and is interested in how social factors affect HIV risk and how we can measure these factors. Her work uses a very interesting approach, social network analysis, to describe and investigate how the web of relationships and individuals embedded in can actually affect their risk of exposure to or protection from HIV. And I think this work is really essential, particularly as despite strides in many aspects of HIV prevention, adolescent girls and young women in sub-Saharan Africa continue to face a significantly higher risk of infection, even as compared to males of a similar age. And like much of the HIV field, STRIVE is concerned with trying to understand why this is and how we can actually intervene to better address this. So today we're very pleased and very excited that Dr. Fearon will present on her research as part of STRIVE into the relationship between HIV risk and the friendship networks of young South African women. So with not much ado, I will hand over to Liz, who will be able to take us through the presentation. Thank you very much, Liz.
Thank you, Nambusi. Yes, so my name is Liz Fearon, and I'm going to be talking about work done during my PhD, looking at the connections between the characteristics of young women's friendships and their HIV risk and sexual behaviors. So first I'll just talk a little bit about HIV amongst young women in South Africa. Then I'll talk about a systematic review we conducted to examine what previous evidence there is on the influences of young people's peers on their sexual behavior from sub-Saharan Africa. In reviewing the literature on this topic, we developed a framework for thinking about different potential mechanisms for the influence of peers on sexual behavior. And then we tried to use this framework to develop research questions for a study of young women's friendships in Northeast South Africa. We were fortunate enough to collaborate with a cash transfers trial, HPTN 068, exploring whether conditional cash transfers amongst 13 to 20-year-old young women would help them to stay in school and thereby reduce HIV incidence. So my study was embedded within that larger trial. So I'll talk about what our findings were regarding the young women's friendships characteristics, and then discuss what we think some of the implications of the work might be. So as Nambusi said, we know that young South African women continue to be high at risk of HIV. That prevalence rises steeply with age from kind of mid-adolescence through to the early 20s, during the period when young women are becoming sexually active and beginning to form their romantic and sexual lives. While surveys have found that HIV status is associated with sexual behaviors that increase the likelihood of exposure to the virus, such as multiple partners or inconsistent condom use, we can't look at young women's behavior in isolation of the social context in which they're embedded. So this is a fundamental point of the STRIVE network. And there's evidence that young women's risk of acquiring HIV comes from socioeconomic factors, although directions of associations have not always been consistent, from their educational status and from social and cultural norms about gender and sexuality. It's not always clear, though, the mechanisms by which these structural factors work. How exactly are cultural norms learned and reinforced? How are cultural norms challenged? What are the mechanisms by which young women's social environments impact on their individual sexual behavior? We know that the characteristics of sexual partners are important, but how do young women meet these partners? And education or being in school might be important, but it's not necessarily clear why that is. So we are positing that the social relationships that young women have, the social environment that they're embedded in, is key in the causal pathways between structural factors to individual behaviors. Young women learn what behavior is normative and expected via their social relationships. Their relationships are also the routes by which information might be obtained or attitudes reinforced, or by which young women might obtain resources or information. So therefore, social relationships might be key to understanding how these structural factors act upon individual young women, or the routes by which young women might negotiate these structural factors or negotiate dominant norms that are important to their risk of HIV. So this is what motivated our study of friendships amongst young women. We know that friendships are key social relationships for adolescents elsewhere in the world. And so we wanted to investigate this amongst young women in this setting. So there's evidence that people in general are subject to the influence of their peers, and particularly from developmental research, we know that adolescents tend to be particularly susceptible to influence from their peers. So by peers, I mean kind of other similar age adolescents. There's a long tradition of research on the role of peer influences on a wide range of behaviors, from criminological research to educational research and examinations of school performance, and a range of health-related behaviors including obesity, physical activity, depression, sleep, and substance use. There's qualitative evidence from South Africa that peer relationships and friendships have influence on young people's romantic and sexual lives by imparting norms or exerting direct pressure, and through practically facilitating the initiation and maintenance of young people's sexual partnerships and relationships. However, we decided therefore to look into whether there was quantitative evidence that young people in sub-Saharan Africa are influenced by their peers on their sexual behavior. So we conducted a systematic review guided by PRISMA methodology and searched 4 databases using terms for sexual behaviors and health-related outcomes of sexual behaviors, including pregnancy, HIV, STIs, terms for peer relationships and friendships, terms for the population we're interested in, and terms for the region. We found 30 studies that included some associational measure of peer influence, stratified by gender or adjusted for gender, and retained 11 of those that met a higher specification of quality criteria. We then classified types of sexual behavior outcome and developed a framework for classifying potential mechanisms of peer influences or types of exposures from peers. We extracted then from each of these studies all of the associations that they looked at between a sexual behavior outcome and a type of peer influence, and amongst boys and girls, because there could have been more than one per study. From this, we found 3 cohort studies, 1 time-to-event study, and 7 cross-sectional. And within them, there were then 37 different peer exposure outcome associations investigated. None of these 11 studies used biological outcome measures for these associations, and there are a variety of types of peer exposures, but some, not all, were examined as part of these 11 studies. So I'll just show you those. Through reviewing papers and literature on peer influence, we kind of hypothesized that there were 6 broad mechanisms by which an individual could be influenced by their peers. Peer socio-demographic attributes such as age or gender could be important. For example, older friends might have connections to other older sexual partners and thus influence whom an adolescent comes into contact with via their own social connections. Peers could be influential via their perceived behaviors. So this is sort of a type of a descriptive norm in sort of social norm terminology. And by that, they provide models or examples of behavior to be emulated. Peer approval, these are like conjunctive norms where adolescents might perceive that their peers would either approve or disapprove of a particular type of behavior, and thus they might feel pressured to adopt or disengage from that behavior. Peer communication, adolescents talk with their friends. Through communication, this is how information diffuses. And this is also the route by which adolescents might either kind of receive normative influence or provide a context in which to question or renegotiate dominant norms. Peer connectedness is a type of kind of provides social or emotional support, and it could indicate the strength of the normative environment. So this might be measured either by like total number of friends, total number of peer connections, or by looking at the degree of interconnectedness amongst peers. And then finally, a young person's status or position within the network of peer relationships could determine their exposure to information, resources, and behaviors, or be a reflection of popularity and status amongst peers. So in terms of what we found, having extracted these 37 peer exposure outcome associations that had been investigated amongst girls or boys, we found basically that half of them showed evidence for an association, looking at p-value, confidence intervals. We didn't conduct a formal meta-analysis because the population's context, the terminology definitions and adjustment strategies differed quite a lot, as did the theoretical foundations underpinning the investigations of peers. We did try and examine broad patterns by gender, by outcome type, and by the type of peer exposure that we allocated according to our framework, but really struggled to find any consistent patterns. It was more common for perceived peer behaviors to be investigated as a type of peer exposure, so asking young people to report whether they perceived all of their friends had had sex or whether they perceived that their sexually active friends all used condoms. This was kind of the most common peer exposure investigated, and sexual debut was the most common outcome type. But the findings really weren't consistent either in terms of whether or not there was statistical evidence for an association, or even in the direction of that association. Whereas we might expect the more peers you perceive to have had sex, the more likely that would make you to have also had sex. It wasn't always quite the case. So essentially our conclusion from this was that really there was a lack of good evidence underpinning whether peers were influential on sexual behavior from this region, and that partly there were some methodological gaps. So there were a lack of studies with biological non-self-reported sexual behavior outcomes. I think because of social desirability bias, potentially in self-reported sexual behavior and self-reported perceived behavior of peers. This is a particular issue. There were very varied theoretical frameworks and thus sort of adjustment strategies and little standardization of terms across studies. Inconsistent approaches to the definition of what a peer meant. And crucially, none of the studies collected data about specific relationships. They all asked about peers in general. And this meant that it was hard to collect more information to help us disentangle whether individuals were being influenced by their peers or whether, for example, they were choosing their peer friendships or other types of effective peer relationships based on pre-existing characteristics. And it also meant that they weren't able to adjust for different characteristics of those peers. So is it age? Is it perceived behavior? Is it communication? So we decided that we needed to find a way of looking at peers specifically rather than talking about them in general. And a framework for doing this is social network analysis, where the focus of attention is really on the relational ties between individuals rather than just on the attributes of those individuals. So the kind of central premises of social network analysis, these are adapted from Wasserman and Faust, is that actors are not independent from each other but are interdependent. We focus on the pattern of relational ties between individuals or groups. This is because resources, ideas, messages, norms, these all travel along relational ties, and thus the structure that this network of ties takes can either create opportunities or constraints to the movement of norms, ideas, and resources. So where an individual is in that overall network could be important. So one type of social network analysis is called an egocentric network approach. In this approach, the focal individual, which is usually the individual who's completing a survey, is called the ego, and then the individuals she reports she has ties to are referred to as alters. In an egocentric study, individuals are asked to describe the characteristics of people they have a particular kind of relationship to, whether that's a friendship, a family relationship, or a sexual partnership, for example. And then they typically describe the attributes of each of their alters. And the characteristics of the relationships that they have with each of them, and then sometimes something about the structure of ties between alters. So some studies then attempt to link together all of these ego nets into what's called a whole network that allows you to see the full structure of a network. But the problem with this is that this requires you to identify alters that are named by the ego in the survey, and that's not always possible or feasible or considered ethical by ethics committees. And then depending on research questions, researchers will then create summary variables across all of the alters to describe the personal network personal network exposure to the participant, to the ego. So we hypothesized that for young women in South Africa, social norms about gender and sexuality and their socioeconomic context shape the environment in which their romantic and sexual lives are formed and form the context for their HIV risk alongside individual household and educational circumstances. The friendships that are formed and sustained within this environment could shape young women's sexual behavior, and that directly impacts the risk of acquiring HIV, such as when young women become sexually active, the characteristics of their sexual partners, and factors such as condom use that occur within these partnerships. The demographic characteristics of friends, such as their age, whether they're in school, or their gender, these might affect the other social connections that these friends have, and therefore might link young women to sexual partners. For instance, older friends might themselves be more likely to have social contacts with older boys and men who could become young women's sexual partners. It's a property of many social networks that have been studied that people tend to form ties with others that are like themselves. So that's why we might expect that older friends of friends who are out of school might provide connections to potential sexual partners who also have these characteristics. The normative environment that young women's friends provide could also be important. Young women who perceive that more of their friends have had sex might be more likely to have had sex themselves. And communication with friends about sex or protecting oneself from HIV could serve as a conduit to promote these dominant norms, but it could also be an opportunity for information sharing and as a forum for young women to renegotiate norms about their role in romantic and sexual relationships and decision making. The extent to which young women's friends are also friends with each other, this is known in the social networks literature as density, and is a measure of kind of peer connectedness, could either exacerbate or diminish the effect of group norms. It's likely that a dense friendship group with a high level of shared norms might be more influential, for example, than a disparate one. And density could also be an indication of social support. So to investigate these hypotheses in our studies, we set out to describe young women's friendship networks and explore associations between young women's friendship networks characteristics and their HIV status, their herpes simplex virus type 2, HSV2 status, and their self-reported sexual behavior and characteristics of sexual partners. And through doing this, we wanted to examine the different potential mechanisms of friend influence, socio-demographic attributes of friends, perceived friendship group norms, communication with friends, and connections amongst friends. And then we also hypothesized that there was a potential effect modification by density. So if young women are embedded within, because it could increase the effect of group norms. So young women whose friends were all connected to each other might experience a stronger effect from their perceived group norms of their friends than friends who were all separate from each other. And then we also looked at the characteristics of young women's friendship ties themselves, such as the frequency by which young women saw their friends and the duration of their friendships, to see whether this altered the relationship between the characteristics of friends and sexual behavior. And then we also looked at whether these effects differed for women in the younger or older age ranges of our sample. So in this talk today, I won't be able to go through all of my findings, but I will try and pull out a few. So in our setting, young women in our sample live in Mpumalanga province, which is in a rural area in the northeast of South Africa. They're primarily part of the Shangaan ethno-linguistic group, and about 1/3 are from families originally from Mozambique. The study site is in the Wits Agincourt Demographic and Household Census Surveillance Site, and it consists of 28 villages and approximately 80,000 people, or maybe a little bit higher now. It's in a district it's in an area that was a former homeland where Black South Africans were confined during apartheid. And while it's rural, it's densely populated, but lacking in good infrastructure or educational and employment opportunities. An HIV prevalence survey conducted there in 2010 found very high HIV prevalence of 19.4% amongst adults, and that was among young women. It was 5.5% aged 15 to 19, but then up to 27% by age 20 to 24. Our study was cross-sectional, and we used this egocentric approach to studying young women's friendship nets that I described earlier. It was nested within the HIV Prevention Trials Network randomized controlled trial investigating potential effect of conditional cash transfers on HIV incidence amongst young women aged 13 to 20. So we inserted a module into the baseline questionnaire that ran from 2011 to 2012, recruiting young women who were eligible for grades 8 to 11, aged 13 to 20, and not pregnant or married at baseline. So this is the questionnaire module on friendships. We asked young women to describe 5 friends each and to respond to a series of questions about each friend in turn and to report on the relationships between each of their friends. So this gave us the following information. About participants in the study, they gave blood samples for HIV and HSV2 testing, so we had HIV and HSV2 status. And through the questionnaire from the main study, they reported on demographic and household characteristics, their sexual behavior, and the characteristics of sexual partners if they were sexually active. For each young woman, we have a description of 5 of her friends, and this is her friendship net or her ego net of friendships, as well as a description of the friends. We know something about friendship ties, the duration of the friendships, and the frequency with which young women saw their friends. And we also knew whether friends were reported to be friends with each other by the participant. So these pictures on the right of this slide just try and give a graphical representation of this information, with the young woman here is in red, her 5 friends are here in blue, and the participant reported friendship ties between the friends are the dotted lines. So we took what's called a personal network exposure approach to young women's friendships, opting to look at each young woman's friendship environment as a whole, rather than at each participant friend pair individually. For each friendship measure, such as age or perceived ever sex, we created summary variables across the 5 friends, and looked at, for example, with ever sex, we looked at the proportion of friends who were thought to have ever had sex. In most cases, this was equivalent to the number of friends, but in the few cases where there was some missing data, we created a proportion and then rounded to the nearest whole friend. So for the number of friends perceived to have had sex, this could range between 0 and 5. We measured the density of the friendship network as the proportion of friendship ties between friends that were reported out of the total number possible. So with 5 friends, this is 10 possible ties. And we then combined communication and discussion data to create what we call a discussion triad measure. This consists of the young woman and 2 friends reported to be friends with each other, with whom the young woman reported discussing sex, condom use, or HIV. And we felt that this sort of measure was important to try and to get at the potential for friendships to renegotiate and discuss dominant norms. So we first described the characteristics of young women and their friendship nets. We used logistic regression to investigate evidence for associations between HIV and HSV2 status and reported ever sex with friendship characteristics. First, we adjusted only for participant age as an a priori confounder, and then we added friendship characteristics in blocks of peer exposure types sequentially. We did this to avoid over-adjusting. So for example, we were interested in the total effect of having older friends. So we put that into the model first and looked at the association, and we then entered the proportion of friends perceived to have had sex, followed by density, and then communication, and then discussion triads. We checked for evidence for interaction by age of participants in case younger women differed from older young women in terms of the importance of friends. And then we also examined whether there was evidence that the effect of friendship characteristics differed by the density of the friendship network and by the tie, by characteristics of each friendship tie. And we did that using models, comparing models for best fit that weighted friends differently according to the frequency by which they were seen and the duration of the friendship. Because we were conducting a cross-sectional analysis, we wanted to exclude young women who might have acquired HIV perinatally, which we weren't able to see exactly because friends obviously wouldn't then be on a causal pathway for perinatal HIV transmission. The young women in this study were born during a period of very high HIV incidence and before prevention of mother-to-child transmission was available. There's evidence from studies elsewhere in Southern Africa that a proportion of these children could have survived through to later childhood and adolescence, and so we felt it was important to look at this, particularly amongst younger women in our age group. So we therefore compared HIV-positive young women who did not report having had sex with those who did. Clearly, this self-reported measure is not a perfect way of distinguishing possible perinatal HIV cases, but our findings when doing so were consistent with the hypothesis that a large proportion of young women who said they'd never had sex but were HIV positive might have been perinatally infected. So therefore, in our primary analysis investigating HIV status as an outcome, we excluded those young women who are HIV positive but did not report having sex. But we report on both when writing out. So the young women in our study, there were 2,326 young women included in my sub-study. The mean age was 15 and a half, and this was sort of evenly spread across school grades. 3.3% of young women, this was 76, were HIV positive, and 106 young women tested positive for HSV2, so 4.6%. And about just over a quarter of young women in this sample reported ever having had sex. And then there were over 1,000 sexual partners reported from 633 sexually active participants with data on age of sexual partners. And so sexual partners were a median 2 years older than young women. There was little evidence that HIV status was clustered by either village or school. We find amongst friendships there was high levels of homophily. This means that young women were quite similar in a number of characteristics to the friends that they reported. The majority of friends, 96%, were female and in school and of a similar age to participants, so very slightly older, a mean of 15.9 versus 15.5. Although 19% of young women had at least one friend who was at least a year older. And by at least a year older, I mean if the young woman was 13, her friend was recorded as 15. So because if she was recorded as 14, it might actually be less than a year. Young women's friendship networks were very dense. So there was a mean of 7 friendship ties out of a possible 10. And young women had known most of their friends for a long time, 2/3 for more than 3 years, and saw them frequently. 86% were seen most or every day. So these graphs show the proportion of young women who report that they perceive friends, so they perceive 0 friends to have had sex, or 1 friend, or 2 friends, etc. So the long blue bar here is the proportion of young women who report that 0 of their friends they perceived were ever pregnant or had had sex or had introduced them to sexual partners. So 39% of young women reported that they perceived none of their friends to be sexually active, while 13% thought that all of their friends were sexually active. 1/3 of young women had at least one friend who they reported had ever been pregnant. Friends also played a role in young women's sexual partnerships. So 40% of young women reported having at least one friend who'd ever introduced them to someone who later became a boyfriend or a sexual partner. More than half of young women reported that they did not talk about HIV, sex, or using condoms with any of their friends. Talking about HIV was slightly more common. I don't show it here, but it was more common to discuss these topics amongst young women who reported that they had ever had sex themselves. When looking at discussion triads, ties between friends with whom the young women discussed these topics, young women had a mean of only 1.3 triads within their friendship networks. And the distribution was quite right skewed, so a very few number of young women discussed all of these topics with all of their interconnected friends. So these are our findings regarding the association between HIV status and friendship network characteristics. These findings are adjusted for participant characteristics also, but I haven't shown all of those associations. They're adjusted for participant age, school grade, whether each parent was alive, household socioeconomic position, and mother's and father's education. In the first model on the left, I've just entered all of the socio-demographic characteristics of friends, so they're all adjusted for each other. And then on the right, the number of friends perceived to have had sex was also then added. So you can see that there's good evidence for an association between having older friends and being HIV positive. Each additional friend was associated with, there was an OR of 1.37 for each additional older friend. And then when we added the number of friends perceived to have had sex to the model, we also found that this was associated with HIV status. So there was an odds ratio of 1.29. We didn't do a formal mediation analysis, but we can kind of see from how the effect size for number of older friends reduces that it's possible that part of the effect of having older friends was because those friends are more likely to be perceived to have had sex. We found similar findings for HSV2 status, which gives us a little more confidence because we would expect a similar causal path. Again, for each additional friend who was at least a year older, this was associated with increased odds of testing positive for HSV2 with an odds ratio of 1.18. And then adding the number of friends perceived to have had sex, this was also associated with being HSV2 positive, also with an odds ratio of 1.18. Here, there was actually a stronger effect for having friends who were older. I haven't fully interpreted that. For both HIV and HSV2, once adjusted for other friendship network characteristics, there was not evidence that having at least one male friend or more friends out of school or more friends who are blood relatives was associated with either HIV or HSV2. So this showed us that it looked like older friends, in more findings that I haven't shown here because of issues around publications, having more friends who were older than the participant was also associated with having older sexual partners. Having older friends and perceiving more friends to have had sex, and then additionally also having a greater number of triads discussing sex, condom use, and HIV was associated with the participant reporting never having had sex themselves. However, there was little evidence for communication or for density of friendships and an association with HIV or HSV2. We didn't find evidence that these effects differed by participant age, and nor did we find evidence that friendship network density modified the effect of the characteristics of friends. It also didn't appear that there was a departure from a linear effect of the number of friends perceived to have had sex or that were older on the outcomes. This might have indicated, for example, that perceiving, there was an effect greater than the sum of its parts for a whole friendship network, but we didn't find evidence to show that. We also didn't find that there was any difference between models that weighted each friend for their frequency of contact with the participant or the duration of that friendship. So it didn't seem that we had evidence that the frequency by which young women saw their friends or how long they'd known them modified the effect of those friends' characteristics. Although it should be said that, as I reported earlier, most young women saw their friends really quite frequently and had known them for quite a long time, so there wasn't so much spread in those variables. So overall, friends tended to be young women of similar age to participants in the study. They were also in school, and about a quarter of them were also blood relatives. Young women had very dense friendship groups where friends were also reported to be friends with each other. Friends overall were slightly more likely to be perceived to have had sex than young women themselves self-reported. But communication about sex, condom use, and HIV was reported to be quite low unless the young woman reported having had sex herself. Young women with a greater number of older friends and more friends perceived to have had sex were more likely to be HIV positive, to be HSV2 positive, and to report ever having had sex. Young women who had greater age gaps with older sexual partners when they had older friends. Discussion of sex, condom use, and HIV was not associated with being HIV positive or HSV2 positive, but it was associated with an increased likelihood of reporting ever having had sex. Sorry, I don't show these specific findings, but it's possible that there's reverse causality in that relationship. And we found little evidence for effect modification by density of the friendship group or by friendship duration or frequency of contact. It was a strength of our study that we had HIV and HSV2 status as outcomes. As I mentioned from our systematic review, we weren't able to find any other explorations of the association between peers and sexual behavior that had these biological outcomes, at least as of a few years ago when we did the review. We also were able to look at different types of peer exposures and tried to apply a framework to think about this. We described specific friendship relationships, and this gives us improved control for confounding, and it allows us to try and look at whether it seems to be age of friends that's important versus perceived behavior of friends. And our data come from an RCT and were generally of high quality. So in terms of limitations, self-reported sexual behavior data and participant-reported characteristics of friends could be inaccurate. I think it's possible that there are social desirability biases both in outcomes and in reported behavior of friends. However, at least when looking at biological outcomes, that should be less of a problem. It's more of a problem if, for example, young women are more likely to underreport having had sex themselves and to underreport the degree to which their friends don't have sex, because that would increase any findings, artificially inflate our findings. There was a small amount of missing friendship data. I think about 3% of friends didn't have data on whether they were perceived to have had sex, but it didn't tend to be that young women underreported that for all of their friends. We had limited ability to try and look at the structural properties of the friendship network, and this is because we weren't allowed to collect information to identify friends that would have allowed us to put together a whole network of friends, of sort of a whole friendship network of young women in the area. And finally, because our study is cross-sectional, there's a possibility of reverse causality. In the peer influence literature, this is known as the influence versus selection problem. So when we find an association between the characteristics of friends and a young woman, we can't know for sure whether that's because young women are influenced in their behavior by that of their friends, or because young women pick friends on the basis of that behavior. But we can say that most young women reported that they'd been friends for a long time, quite possibly longer than they'd been sexually active. So it makes it unlikely that all of the effect that we've seen is due to that selection effect. So what we can conclude is that the normative environment for friendships seems to be important for sexual behavior and HIV risk amongst young women in South Africa. The perceived peer norms of behavior seems to be an important mechanism, potentially important mechanism for influencing young women's HIV risk. But we have less clear conclusions around communication with friends, and we can't say for certain what the direction of causality is from the study. It does, however, seem that the sociodemographic characteristics of friends is important, particularly that having older friends might lead young women to also then have older sexual partners, and having older friends was associated with HIV and HSV2 status. There were some previous findings from a study in the Cape area that found young women who were exposed to older age school classmates for a greater length of time were more likely to have early sexual debut, and our findings are consistent with those. And the implications are that I think that we need to consider young women's social environment when we're thinking about programming HIV prevention and youth programming. Also in terms of thinking about school policies on grade repetition and age mixing and friendships. So it might be that there can be, this is changing I think in South Africa now, but historically there'd been particularly high levels of age mixing in of age mixing in classes because people who didn't pass that year were held back a year. And it's possible that high levels of age mixing within classrooms could also lead to high levels of age mixing within friendships. And from our findings, that would suggest that might not be a good thing from an HIV risk point of view. I think our findings also speak to the selection of peer educators in HIV prevention programming. It might be important to think about the characteristics of the peer versus the individual receiving health promotion messages for those sorts of programs. So thank you to my supervisors for my PhD, under which I did most of this work, James Hargreaves and Dick Wiggins, to my funders, the Bloomsbury Group and the London International Development Centre, to the HBTN 068 trial, and the young women and their guardians participating in that study. Thank you.
Hi, this is Caroline Tangorin. I had a quick question. So when you were talking about how the perceived peer norms may be important, but density didn't seem to matter in the network as far as the importance of those perceived peer norms. Do you think that was more a result of restricting the social network to just 5 individuals? Or why do you think density wasn't more important if the density of the network reinforces the peer norm?
Yeah, I might have expected to find that, young women with denser networks experienced a greater effect of the dominant norms of their network. It's possible that restricting it to 5 friends may have had that effect, particularly because I found that density was really quite high in most friendship groups. I think the mean was about 7 out of 10. Friends were reported to be friends also with each other, so it might be there was just kind of little variance in what was reported. It did make me wonder whether young women, whether the friendship ties that they were reporting between their friends really meant the same thing as when we ask young women to report on their 5 closest friends, because we assume that they are when we're measuring it that way. It might be that by friend in that case, we did measure friend-to-friend ties as existing if the participant reported that those 2 friends were either close friends or friends with each other. And possibly if I just looked at close friends, maybe I would have found a difference. I haven't done that. But I think it had something to do with how young women were describing the friendship ties between their friends.
Great, thank you so much.
So I thought that the point about older friends, about the sociodemographic importance of friends the point about having older friends and the association between that and having older sexual partners and be more likely to be HIV positive, HSV2 positive, I thought this was quite an interesting point. Previous research on peer influence had found, for example, that programs tended to want to put together people who were experiencing the same sorts of problems, for example. This more comes from literature on criminology. But they then found that putting together, say, for example, all of the young people who were prone to particular problems together tended to increase their likelihood of experiencing those problems more. So I think that that's something to think about with programming, for example. If we were taking all vulnerable young people and putting them together, that might be a problematic thing from a health promotion point of view. On age mixing, so this is just one study that's cross-sectional, and so speaking to whole educational policies would be problematic, but it does sort of suggest that having policies that encourage high levels of age mixing within grades, and you could extend that to think about other social environments in which young people are likely to form friendships, that might not be a positive thing from a sexual health perspective if young people are therefore more likely to form friendships with older peers and therefore be exposed potentially to older sexual partners or to norms that are more common amongst older groups of people. I think it leads us to think about some caution as to what kind of social environment we're creating for young people through the programming that we're doing. I very much don't want the conclusions of the study to be seen as tell young women not to be friends with girls who've had sex. That I think is not at all the kind of conclusion I would want to be drawn, but more to think about how do we create social environments for young people and what does that mean in terms of the relationships that they form. So yeah, that's something, a point of concern that I have about these kinds of results, because I know from social network studies on other topics, for example, work done on obesity amongst adults, that was all reported in the media as dump your fat friends, and that's not the message that I want to get across from this study.
Brilliant. Thank you, Liz. And yes, if anyone else has a question, do please dial *7 to unmute yourself or type a message in the chat box. I have a quick question to perhaps ask. I think it would relate somewhat to Jamie's question there. You mentioned in your presentation that young women who have older friends are more likely to have older sexual partners. I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you mean by older sexual partners. In your presentation, you suggested that older friends is at least 1 year older than them, and the epidemiological data on HIV prevalence amongst adolescent women and young girls suggests that 15 to 24-year-old women have a much higher prevalence than their male counterparts, which suggests that the older partners are sort of older than that. And I wonder then if there was any data or any sense of the role of transactional sex in the older partner relationships, sexual partner relationships that you have in your data.
So I haven't looked at transactional sex specifically, but what I did look at was the age of sexual partners. So young women who were sexually active could report on the characteristics of up to 3 sexual partners that they'd had. And if I looked at the age difference between the young women and the ages of those reported partners, and then I looked at the association between the number of friends who were at least 1 year older and that age difference as the outcome. and I found that adjusted for other friendship sociodemographic characteristics and attributes of the participant, that each additional friend at least 1 year older was associated with, I think it was a 0.37 increase in age difference between young women and that partner, with the partner being older. So that was the finding that I had regarding sexual partners.
I'm sorry, can you please clarify what you mean? How much older is older in terms of years?
So the mean age difference between young women and their sexual partners was 2 years, with 2 being the male partner. Yeah, sorry to say that. 2 being the male partner being older than young women. So that's the kind of range that I mean. But I looked at just the increase in that age difference as associated with each additional older friend, and that was 0.37 years increase in older sexual partner age difference compared to the young women. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liz. And there's a question here from Janine Carmichael. She says, what are your thoughts on how this research should influence the selection of peer educators?
So I guess I thought it was just important to think about the social connections that peer educators might themselves have. So whether if you're choosing peer educators who are mainly older than the young people with whom they're interacting, I guess peers we kind of consider to be roughly in a similar age range, but it may not, there's some caution to be expressed via having young women being in contact with a lot of other older, for example, peer educators. I guess I didn't find a difference in effect between in the importance of friendship relationships by how long someone had known those friends and so on. So, I think I should say that while I think this thinking about characteristics of peers vis-a-vis each other in that peer educator young person relationship is related, but obviously I wasn't looking specifically at that relationship. I was looking more at friendship. So I think trying to draw some information about thinking about the attributes of young people vis-a-vis each other is important. But I probably shouldn't overdraw the conclusions from my research about friendships to that peer educator participant relationship itself.
Great. Thank you, Liz. As I say, if anyone has any other questions, do please type them into the chat box or unmute yourself using *7. In the meantime, as we wait in case anyone has any further questions, I wonder, Liz, what do you see as the next steps for this research? What would you, with more funding and more opportunity, what would you like to investigate next to take this work forward?
Well, I'm interested in looking at follow-up data of so this was done using baseline data, and we do ask about friends later in time. So trying to look at, whether trying to look at over time, we could sort of improve our strength of evidence for looking into causal effects. I do think that thinking about ways that we can sample whole networks of friendships are important, because I'm particularly interested in trying to understand how the position of young women vis-a-vis others within her friendship network might be important. From the qualitative studies I was looking at, it was sort of unclear to me often whether having sex, having had a boyfriend, transactional sex, these are often seen as associated with a higher status for young women amongst her peers, but at the same time, young women, there's also a lot of discussion of young women having to hide their sexual and romantic lives because of social condemnation. So I'm sort of curious to know whether young women who are more popular within the network of other young women are more likely or less likely to have had sex or to be at higher risk for HIV. And it's difficult to investigate some of these structural network properties without thinking of ways to sample young women's friendship networks where we can look at the structure of those ties. Like I said, it's challenging from an ethical and logistical point of view to try and look at that, but there is some work on network sampling that would be interesting to apply here.
Great. Thank you, Liz. And I see that Guy Harling has his hand raised. Guy, if you could unmute yourself, pressing *7, we'd love to hear your question. I'm not quite sure. Guy Harling, can you hear me? And if you do have a question, do please unmute yourself, or if you prefer, you could type the message into the chat box and I can read it out. Guy says he can hear us but having trouble with the microphone, so he's going to try and write his question. So we'll give Guy a second to do that. I feel as if I'm dominating with the questions here. But as we wait for Guy to finish completing his question, I wonder, Liz, if you would have anticipated any differences had it not been the rural, densely populated, low-income population that you did the study in. If, for example, it was a very high urban sort of township community, would you anticipate any differences in your findings or in the study?
Yeah, I don't know whether young women in an urban or township setting, whether they might be likely to have a greater diversity within their friendship networks, and whether that, a greater diversity by, for example, whether or not friends have attended school or just the backgrounds of those friends. That's hard to know. There's been little research from in this part of the world. I wonder also if young people in urban context had a wider range of potential influences on their behavior than young people in this context. Whether that would make any difference, I'm not sure. Whether friends, it's hard to say. There needs to be more research on, I think, young women's friendships in and of themselves. How these friendships form and how are they sustained? How do young people choose their friendships, and how do they vary in importance over time? I think understanding, some of these fundamental things, and I didn't have a qualitative component to my study, but I think that would have been a benefit to really understand the place of friendships in young women's lives. So I should add that to a further research. I think that would be of interest. But yeah, it's hard to know. It might be that young women in urban settings have different sorts of friends, and that those friends are important in different ways. I'm not sure.
Perhaps influence of social media and so on. So I think it's fascinating, really, really exciting work. Guy has managed to get through. So his question is: thinking about intervention options, would it be fair to say that the findings point to the importance of who you spend time with versus what you talk about, or might there be potential for more focused and organized discussions as an intervention?
Yeah, I think it's true that in my findings, when adjusting for the demographic characteristics of friends and the perceived behaviors of those friends, I didn't find much of an association then for discussion with sex, HIV, and condom use amongst those friends and HIV or HSV2 status. I was particularly worried with the communication friendship exposures about reverse causality. And to what extent young women reported that they talked about sex with their friends only when they had sex. Particularly some of these girls were still fairly young. 15 was the mean age, and only 27% of young women reported ever having had sex themselves. So I did wonder whether, first of all, young women didn't really talk about it amongst their friends until they became sexually active, or whether they just didn't want to report that they talked about it with their friends if they were also hadn't or were unwilling to report that they'd had sex. So I was particularly worried about reverse causality regarding the communication findings, but it would be fair to say that my findings are not consistent with promoting communication about these topics amongst adolescents. But whether, again, I've only looked at friendships, and I wouldn't want to overdraw those conclusions. I do think, it might be worth, if you were trying to create a forum for focused and organized discussions as an intervention, it would be worth thinking about the composition of that forum of, are you going to have a big age mix or gender mix of adolescents, or it might be worth thinking about that.
Great, fantastic, thank you. Guy also says thanks as well. Does anybody else have any final questions before we wrap up? If not, if I'm allowed to continue hogging the mic here, I'll just have one final question. What was the youngest age that you had ethical clearance to interview?
So the young women in this study were all women that were recruited to the baseline of the cash transfer study, and the youngest age there was 13.
13, okay, fantastic. Thank you. So unless there are any other final questions there, I'd love to take this opportunity to thank Liz for her presentation. It's given a lot of very important and useful areas for further thought, particularly with relation to what this means for how we intervene and how we support adolescent women, young girls going forward, and the influence that their peer networks may have. So thank you very much indeed, Liz.